Does evolution exist? The central question of this video. However, what do we mean when we talk about evolution? Some of you probably think of the abstraction of smooth development and complexity. Some of you think it's a silly fiction of Darwinist, bigoted scientists. Some of you think the exact opposite. Evolution is a scientific fact. You can express evolution through another word. Evolution is progress. Against the backdrop of the catastrophes of the 20th and even the 21st century, the ecological crisis, growing economic inequality, the proponents of progress or evolution of society still continue to claim that humanity is moving forward. The fires of the Inquisition have been extinguished. Mass riots are happening less and less often. People are living longer and longer, and human rights and freedoms are spreading around the world, even in spite of opposition from authoritarian regimes. And so the following question becomes especially relevant for us. Is evolution, that is movement from simple to complex, from primitive to perfect, a fundamental objective law that applies to all living things? If we look at this question from a biological perspective, the answer is obviously yes. Evolution has been proven long ago. It's a scientific fact. Life is changeable and adaptive. After the moment of abiogenesis, the transformation of non-living matter into living matter, there is a breaking of the old universe. After the emergence of life, a force emerges, structuring matter at a pace and scale never seen before. A little later comes Homo sapiens, the ideas of the Age of Enlightenment, and finally Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. The concept of evolution, progress, development, and movement toward a bright future officially takes over the globe. However, the optimism of the Age of Enlightenment is being replaced by pessimism. Today, it is more and more difficult to believe in the course of history, in the development of mankind, in our evolution. It feels like the world is rapidly rolling into the abyss. But you are not alone in this feeling. Today, to doubt the idea of progress, that is the evolution of society, a quick glance through the newsfeed is enough. Alienation and political confrontation in the world are on the rise. The environment is being polluted. People are suffering from hunger and poverty. Tomorrow looks daunting. The dystopian scenario, be it nuclear winter or global warming, a dystopian Orwellian dictatorship, or a unifying consumer society in the spirit of Huxley or Black Mirror, looks less and less fantastic. Enlightenment philosophers believed that human history moved in an upward direction, from primitive forms of production and social organization to more advanced ones, from tyranny to freedom, from the darkness of superstition and mysticism to the light of science. It seemed then that the evolution of our society, culture, art, and consciousness was unstoppable. Today's historical process seems to be absolutely non-linear, more like chaos, in the face of which man is simply powerless. We find ourselves on the other side of the screen, frozen in the horror of watching catastrophes. As Francis Fukuyama, an American philosopher who argues that the spread of liberal democracies around the world may signal the end of humanity's political evolution and become the final form of human government, put it, the 20th century has turned us into profound pessimists. It turns out evolution, the development of earthly life that began billions of years ago, has stopped. The pendulum of progress has swung backwards. Have we reached the ceiling of development both biologically and ideologically? Are we destined to fall? A dive into the topic suggests that creating an issue on evolution is pointless. After all, evolution, the fundamental movement toward perfection, does not exist. The development of life is just an accident, and ideas about a bright future are nothing more than cognitive distortions. But some would definitely disagree and say that this is not really the case. Evolution exists, progress continues, and our era is the best time mankind has ever lived in. The name of this optimist is Steven Pinker. In this issue, you will be immersed in the historical, scientific, and philosophical context of the amazing phenomenon of evolution. This issue is unique in that it will present both the evolutionist and creationist positions, Evolution comes from the Latin word evolutio, which means unfolding or development. The generally accepted interpretation is as follows. Evolution is a natural process of development of living nature, accompanied by changes in the genetic composition of populations, adaptations, speciation, and extinction. Evolution is a scientific fact. In this respect, biologists are quite unanimous. There is no doubt that evolution proceeds spontaneously, without control by intelligent forces, by natural causes. The details, mechanisms, driving forces and patterns, and pathways of evolution are the main subject of research of theoretical biologists these days. It is impossible to separate biology from evolutionary concepts. As one of the greatest theoretical biologists of the 20th century, Theodosius Dobzhansky, said, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." Dobzhansky, in 1927, who emigrated to the United States, was a man of faith. He was an Orthodox Christian. He went to church regularly, took communion, and fasted. His example refutes the claim that evolutionary teachings are supposedly incompatible with religion. A biologist can distract himself from evolution only if he concentrates on a very small task. For example, studying the lime structure of some beetle. But it is necessary to look at the problem even a little wider, for example, to start comparing this beetle with others in order to determine its place in the classification, and immediately it turns out that evolutionary ideas aren't needed. It is necessary to understand how and why the beetle was formed this way. The world scientific community believes that the evidence for evolution available today is so irrefutable and comprehensive that evolution is no longer a hypothesis or a theory, but a firmly established, proven scientific fact. To deny it while remaining within the bounds of science is impossible today. But here, a creationist philosopher, one might argue, a fact is not something to be proven. A fact is something that is observed, felt, and perceived. If something needs to be proven, then that something is not a fact. This is a logical conclusion. Creationists reinforce this by saying that, for example, the diversity of species is an observable, unproven fact, whereas evolution is not a fact. Therefore, any savvy creationist will insist that one must separate the concepts of fact and scientific fact. The argument is as follows. Since humans are time and space-limited beings, it is impossible for each of us to be convinced of a fact on our own. So, for example, for those who have not been to Australia, its existence is not an observable fact. But we trust the testimonies of people who have been there, so we consider the existence of Australia to be a fact. So if some facts we cannot experience directly, we have to take them on faith. And this is where creationists go off the deep end. Consequently, there are communities of people for whom something is a fact because they trust the testimony of those who have directly dealt with that fact. As a consequence, different pictures of the world emerge among different groups of people, which describe different facts. And what is recognized as a fact in one world picture, and for one group of people, may not be recognized as a fact in another world picture. Creationists argue in the following. For the believer, the existence of God is a fact attested to by those who have directly experienced His presence. But this fact is not recognized in the scientific picture of the world because scientists study only physical phenomena and abstract from all metaphysical causes. On this basis, scientists have developed their own concept of fact, which covers the realm of exclusively natural, roughly speaking, material physical phenomena. So, you really can't argue with the last statements. The scientific picture really studies physical phenomena and abstracts from metaphysics. Proponents of divine creation appeal to the fact that scientific fact is not something that is directly perceived at all. Scientific fact combines both observational results and inferences, and scientists agree that these conclusions are what they will regard as scientific fact. That is, a scientific fact is a mixture of observations, logical inferences, and agreements that have meaning only within a scientific picture of the world. Thus, creationists question the truth of scientific fact as such and argue that evolution is not a fact because it is impossible to witness it. But creationists have more serious arguments. As already mentioned, the word evolution comes from the Latin evolutio and means unfolding, development. And here creationists fully enter into the game and say, only that which has the potential for development, that is, the possibility of development, can evolve. The potential for development is that which initially exists and unfolds over time. That is, evolution is the realization of the originally pre-existent. And how can the preordained exist? The creationist will answer, only in an absolute divine, spiritual, ideal form. Don't think we have gotten distracted. For the key to understanding the creationist worldview is idealism. Idealism is the idea of the primordiality of the spirit, the consciousness of the ideal. The argument to prove idealism usually goes like this. If something changes, then there is something unchanging about that thing. Any change in a thing presupposes that something remains in that thing that makes that thing a given thing. What is meant by this? Take, for example, a human being. During his life he changes, sometimes beyond recognition. He changes even at the cellular level. He changes outwardly, his character traits, his beliefs, but there is still something in him that makes him the same person. Idealists rely on the fact that in any change, there is an unchanging denominator, the basis or the subject of these changes, and that subject is unchanging. This immutability is called essence, idea or ideal by idealists. All creationists agree that God, the ideal or absolute, once upon a time and long ago gave life a concrete meaning and purpose, while biologists are forced to recognize and not recognize the expediency of life at the same time. Within the framework of natural sciences, nothing has a purpose at all. The scientific picture of the world is based on the principle of causality and understanding that the causes of events are in the past. The cause cannot be in the future, modern science asserts. It follows that there can be no purpose to anything. There is no purpose to the rotation of the Earth around the Sun. Chemical reactions and life, respectively, has no meaning either. If the meaninglessness of the process of formation of stars and planets can be accepted somehow, the meaninglessness of life is logically impossible to accept. At the same time, any biologist will confirm that the meaning or purpose of any living organism is self-reproduction. In this matter, you are surely in solidarity with creationists. To deny the purpose of life is simply silly. The living subdues the non-living, changes the course of mechanical causality, adjusts it to itself. If a stone is simply heated by heat, the organism can assess whether this heating is useful or unhelpful to it. It actively reacts and acts in its own interest. Today we will go further. With a reliance on logic and common sense, we will understand the mechanics behind evolution. We'll dive into the historical context, learn what Charles Darwin even formulated, and who he was. Let's understand whether humanity is progressing or degenerating. And beyond that, let's try to trade our own path to truth, taking the best ideas from creationists and evolutionists. Brace yourselves. No one has ever looked at evolution this way before. If you like what I'm doing and want to support my work, give me a like. Leave a comment, subscribe. So first of all, we must deal with the expediency of life. If we recognize the difference between living and non-living things, if we recognize the fact of life striving for self-preservation, then the principle of mechanical causality in the case of life ceases to work. The purpose of an embryo, for example, is to develop into an adult. This goal is embedded in it initially in the form of genetic information, and so it acts from the past as a pre-assigned program, giving the image of an adult which the embryo strives to realize in itself in the future. But these are all relative goals, goals that fit within the limits of an individual's life. But life itself, as we have already realized, contains an absolute unconditional goal: the preservation of itself, and this is very important. The subject of life is the one who develops and evolves. What does science say about this? According to Richard Dawkins, The subject of the evolutionary process is none other than genes, that is, DNA, which are essentially the instructions for the formation of an organism. The basic unit of selection of independent interest is not the species, the group, or even, strictly speaking, the individual. The basic unit is the gene, the unit of heredity. To the proposal to regard the gene as the subject of life and evolution, creationists respond as follows. It is as absurd to consider the gene as a subject with its own purposes, and the individual as a superstructure above it, a ship carrying the gene through time, as it is absurd to consider that the subject, the one who initiates the process of furniture production at IKEA, is the assembly instructions enclosed in each box. Let's concretize the creationist position on this issue. A gene cannot be the subject of evolutionary development. I think most of you understand evolution as the formation of many complex biological forms from a few simple ones. Memory, consciousness, expedient reactions, and creative activity are considered products of evolution. Evolution is about change. As idealists argue, change presupposes something unchanging. That is, for something to remain itself, that something must retain some traits. Idealists are convinced that change is possible only on the basis of something unchanging. Creationists try to prove the existence of the unchangeable, that is, the ideal, through the structure of the atom, and more specifically through the electron. The electron, like other elementary particles, has no dimensions. This is confirmed by modern physics. What we consider the size of a particle is only the distribution of its electric charge in space. That is, the charge is there. The force of attraction and repulsion is also there, but there is no source of these forces as something extended in space. We fix localized manifestations of the electron in space, but we do not fix the electron itself. This can mean only one thing. The subject, which in this case we call the electron, and which is the source of the forces of attraction and repulsion, is not material. And since the same is the case with other elementary particles, an unexpected and logical conclusion follows from this. Everything that we consider to be matter is only the actions of immaterial subjects. That is, any body is a non-material subject possessing material manifestations. The body is the unity of the ideal and the material, idea and matter. Further conclusions among creationists are roughly as follows. The source of the world system can only be thought of as God. Creationists also believe that consciousness could not under any circumstances have appeared in the process of evolution. They explain this by saying that consciousness is a certain interaction between subject and object, as a result of which the object appears in the subject's consciousness. That is, in fact, it becomes a part of the subject's consciousness, and only that which is already initially contained in consciousness, in an ideal form, can appear in consciousness. According to idealists, only a stage and fullness of consciousness can evolve. And finally, God, or the Absolute, understandably, cannot be the result of evolution either. After examining the philosophical evidence of creationists, I decided to dive into the so-called scientific creationist literature. What did I find? Without going into detail, I will describe the big picture. According to creationists with a biological bent, paleontological findings cannot prove Darwinism and evolution because they may have different explanations. The sudden appearance of new biological taxa, that is, groups in classification, in the paleontological record can be explained either by evolution or by intelligent causes, including divine power. According to creationists, a large number of fossils provide evidence for particular moments in creation. In addition, creationists cite the evolutionary trends of airplanes and dinosaurs as an argument, pointing out the similarity of change in both animals and man-made airplanes. The correlation between changes in the size of airplanes and dinosaurs is presented by creationists as clear evidence of intelligent design of life. Likewise, creationists consider transitional life forms to be theoretical speculation on the part of scientists. They emphasize that the notion of a transitional form is difficult to prove because there always remains doubt about the reality of the transitional status of the forms found. It is as if they have not heard of evolutionary leaps, and ultimately creationists ask the question, why aren't we observing evolution right now? The answer that evolution at the macro level is a very slow and hard to observe process does not suit them, of course. But that is not what is most interesting. Creationists propose an alternative paradigm of thinking to the generally accepted paradigm, a paradigm that could shake our faith in human evolution. According to creationists, modern culture is obsessed with the development of evolutionary progress. All politics and economics are fixated on sustainable development. Science drives forward technological progress and proves that humans are the result of biological evolution. In private life, we believe that the most important thing is personal growth and development. Even from spiritual practices, we expect some tangible result. The problem here is that the view of the universe as something evolving and progressing is a consequence of the worldview paradigm that dominates the minds of people in Western culture. According to creationists, this paradigm is a kind of rose-colored glasses through which Westerners view the world. Many religious thinkers are convinced that what we understand as development is actually degradation. In a short period of history, namely in the transition from the age of tradition to the age of modernity, there was a reformatting of our cultural consciousness. The objective process of deterioration and degradation suddenly began to be understood as progress, as a progressive movement towards a more developed state. The movement from the fullness of being to disintegration began to be understood in reverse, as a movement from emptiness to fullness, from the abstract to the concrete, from lower forms of matter to higher ones. The philosophical notion of degradation, deterioration, and descent in ancient and medieval philosophy was inextricably linked to the concept of falling away. We shall call this degradation, the estrangement of the lower spheres of being from the higher spheres, and from God, the ideal state of the idea, falling away. But besides the fact that development is, as you have already found out, the realization of some goal, it is also complication. That is, differentiation. What is meant by this? In the embryo of a living being, the organs are still undifferentiated, but in the adult, the organs are fully developed, differentiated, and easily distinguishable. The first moment is the whole without differentiation of parts. The second moment, the moment of differentiation, is the transition of the whole into multiplicity. It is a process of complication. And the third moment, the moment of integration, is the synthesis of the whole and the parts. After all, the whole makes separate elements exactly its parts, parts of the unity. Therefore, in a developing system, differentiation is inextricably linked to integration, inclusion in the composition. This integration is what creates vital complexity. This is how emergence works. And we immediately have a question. Can we reduce development only to the aspect of differentiation, ignoring the aspect of goal realization, as modern scientists do? According to creationists, no. But development is not limited to the complication of structure. For example, if we talk about the physical development of an adult, it is obvious that the differentiation of organs has already taken place. And now, performing physical exercises, a person realizes the potentialities of his organs, strengthening and increasing their strength. No complication of the organism and appearance of new organs occurs here, but at the same time, a person develops physically. In the creationist worldview, the world is initially created perfect, that is corresponding to its idea and design. But the world in the person of man is given freedom of self-determination. Thus, the primordial world is initially in a situation of unstable equilibrium. It may or may not fall away from the ideal state. Well, we can agree with creationists that we unconsciously project the stages of development of an individual living organism onto the development of all living nature or mankind as a whole. As a consequence, we conclude that nature and society evolve from a less perfect state to a more perfect state. We interpret the complication and differentiation of the world and society as a movement towards a more perfect state, And based on this premise, we explain the existence of complex organisms by their emergence from simpler ones. And we consider the complex modern society to be more perfect than the ancient society. It is hard not to agree with creationists that the stages of development of an individual organism and the stages of development of a society, of course, do not coincide. Creationists believe that while an individual person's initial infantile state is under development, which gradually progresses to maturity and then to old age, the collective consciousness of society or the collective mind, on the contrary, begins at once with maximum spirituality and reasonableness. The idea that mankind is moving from maximum rationality to minimum rationality comes into conflict with the already familiar idea that mankind is developing from a primitive state to a civilized state. Some creationists believe in the concept of the Golden Age, or the primordial state of the world, in which nature and man first maximize their original potential and then move into a state of decay. We will return to the creationist position, but now we must turn to the opposite side. We must answer two questions. How did the idea of evolution take over our minds? And what is the evolution of species? Robert Fitzroy, a 26-year-old British Navy captain with noble roots, embarking on an expedition to the coast of South America, decided that he would feel much safer if he had a partner on the voyage. Such a role Fitzroy offered Cambridge professor of botany and mineralogy John Stevens Henslow. But he refused a business trip to the end of the world, allegedly taking pity on his wife. And he was right to do so. Instead of the planned 2 years, the Beagle will sail around the southern hemisphere for 5. Henslow offered to outfit his 22-year-old student, whose name was Charles Darwin, for the expedition. Fitzroy hesitated. Having met Darwin and being a physiognomist, he concluded that he was too weak. But in the end, he took Darwin with him after all. As soon as the Beagle departed from the English port of Plymouth, taking the course towards South America, December 27, 1831, Darwin became unbearably ill. Seasickness was to blame. Some 30 years later, in 1860, the most important clash in the history of science took place at the Oxford Museum of Natural History, a debate between Charles Darwin and representatives of the Church. The Oxford debate was the moment of humanity's turn from the theory of intelligent creation to the theory of evolution, a turn from idealism and faith to materialism and science. After the voyage on the Beagle, it was, as has already been said, about 30 years. By this time, Darwin is already a famous naturalist who has just published The Theory of Evolution by Natural Selection. Immediately after its appearance, Darwin's theory created a furor. It seemed to be the talk of the world. We do not have exact recordings of the debate, but presumably the program included several speeches defending different points of view. Interestingly, the evolutionists were not represented at this debate by Charles Darwin, but by the famous English biologist and Darwin supporter Thomas Huxley, who would go on to be nicknamed Darwin's Bulldog and partly write himself into history by doing so. The Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce, spoke on behalf of the Church. There were about 500 or even 1,000 people in the audience. The Oxford debate is a special event, a real scientific battle, the likes of which simply do not exist in the modern world. The elderly and important Wilberforce mocked Huxley and shouted that he was the grandson of an ape. The young and defiant Huxley replied that he would rather be the grandson of an ape than a bigot cut off from understanding the nature of things. There was an uproar in the crowded museum. No one was listening to anyone. And against this background, Robert Fitzroy himself, no longer a young captain, but a counter-admiral and a deeply religious man, was given the floor. Against the background of the reserved and sarcastic Wilberforce, Fitzroy literally explodes the hall with his passion. He shakes the Bible above his head, calls out to the crowd, curses Darwin and his fictions. Huxley responds arrogantly to his speech by saying that Darwin's book is a logical enumeration of facts. There was no independent judging at the time, understandably. But since in the following 10 years, there were more supporters of the theory of evolution than opponents, it is clear who won. The hatred of evolutionary theory continued to plague Robert Fitzroy. He was already suffering from mental health problems. Combined with financial difficulties, all of this brought the former Captain Beagle to the end he was so eager to avoid. 5 years after the Oxford debate, he cut his throat with a razor. On that somber note, it's time to talk about Darwin's major work, The Origin of Species. The full title of Darwin's book is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. That is, the essence of the origin of species is not actually the origin of species, but that species come about by natural selection. Darwin developed the idea of evolution in his study for over 20 years, so he didn't have a spectacular moment of insight like Newton. But Darwin did have the Galapagos finches. The Galapagos is a volcanic archipelago west of Ecuador. Importantly, the Galapagos Islands have never been in contact with the big land. Everything that grows, runs, and flies there was brought there. The islands are close enough to the mainland that birds rarely, but still reach them. In relation to each other, the islands are also at a considerable but manageable distance. Darwin carefully and systematically studied the flora and fauna of the Galapagos, dried herbarium of every plant he saw, shot birds, and collected their numerous carcasses. In this way, Darwin amassed a huge collection of finches. There were many finches on the Galapagos Islands, more than any other bird. But the interesting thing was that on each island, the finches were slightly different. What differed most strongly was the shape of their beaks. Some finches were better suited to catching insects, others to a plant-based diet. If several different beaks were found on the same island, they differed greatly. For example, one beak was large, perfect for cracking nuts, while another was thin and pecked cacti. Legend has it that this observation sparked an argument between Darwin and Fitzroy. The latter argued that the different finches came from different foci of creation, each taking into account the conditions of different islands. Darwin, on the other hand, had his doubts. What if God's design had nothing to do with it? What if the different finches had evolved on their own from a common ancestor that had flown in from the mainland, by descent with modification, by evolution? Do you remember that all of this is according to legend? First, Darwin himself was in the Galapagos, just beginning to conceive of his future theory. Secondly, Fitzroy did not propose any foci of creation, although it sounds, you will agree, logical. Thirdly, at least some of the above details of finches' lives were only discovered on his return to London. The whole point is that Darwin was not an ornithologist and considered finches to be subspecies. And apparently, he did not immediately realize that different subspecies lived on different islands. He returned home with so many dead birds that it was almost comical. When a more knowledgeable ornithologist confidently identified the finches shown to him as 12 different species, it stunned both the ornithologist and Darwin himself. In 19th century categories, the difference between species and subspecies is fundamental. Species, as it was then thought, are freestanding life forms created by God. Subspecies are variations within these freestanding species, that is, breeds, not to be modified. If different finches on different islands are different species, it means that God created them that way. It is in such numbers and such variety. The significance of the finches is that their example shows how absurd it is. An unknowable creator can explain anything. Usually, the creator is intuitively the most obvious explanation. But in the case of the notorious finches, it seems much more intuitive to accept Darwin's suggestion that the birds gradually dispersed and gradually changed. The point about the origin of species is that this fracture of intuition can be taken and expanded to encompass all of nature. In any place where an intelligent creator is clearly visible, one can look closely and discern a gradual change moving away from the trajectory of the distant past. The essence of the origin of species is as follows. First, the form of living things is changeable. Brothers and sisters are different from each other, and from the seeds of the same fruit, different shoots may sprout. Second, this variability is inherited to some extent. Dogs of different breeds produce dogs of their own breed. Third, in nature, after all, some survive and some do not, because resources are not infinite. This survival is not random. It depends on inherited traits. Hence, just as a breeder breeds vegetable varieties by gradual selection of the largest fruits, so the environment breeds species by natural selection. The genetic code most adapted to the demands of the environment will continue to be inherited from the different variants. And so, over time, species must change towards greater adaptability. From the above, we can derive the following formula. Variability plus heredity plus selection equals evolution. If we think of evolution as a car that moves through time rather than space, variability is the fuel of evolution, the thing that basically allows it to move. If everything in the world is the same, there is nowhere for anything new to come from. Heredity is the wheels of evolution, the thing that drives the machine forward. Heredity is the fundamental feature of life that allows it to evolve. It is the reproduction of what variability has invented. Variability means that there are many different variants, and heritability that these variants have the property of creating their own likeness. This property changes the relationship of variability over time. The heritability of a trait gives it access to eternity. If a variant is not inherited, then it will not play a role in the long run. Stones are fantastically variable. Try finding two stones with the same shape. But this variability does not lead to the evolution of stones, because stones have no heredity. The shape of a stone is fleeting, and once it's gone, it leaves nothing behind. Living organisms, on the other hand, are able to recreate their own traits in a new physical form. These recreations are called generations. The property of heredity and the existence of generations is a fundamental difference between living matter and non-living matter. If variability is the fuel and heredity is the wheels, then selection is the driver. It is selection that decides where the car goes. The driver, however, is worth talking more about. Indian snake charmers, who supposedly hypnotize the animal with the melody of their whistle, are really just taking advantage of the fact that the snakes repeat the motion behind their instrument. It is not uncommon to use for this trick the Indian cobra, known in addition to the famous hood for its peculiar pattern on the back. Two black spots connected at the bottom by an arc jumper. This, you won't argue, resembles something like eyes. The cobra is a predator that feeds mainly on rodents and frogs. The cobra prefers to avoid large animals. But why would it have eyes on its hood? To deter large animals sneaking up from behind. There's very little vertical symmetry in nature. We humans have bridges and buildings. But in the forest, the main vertical symmetry is the eyes pointing straight at you, and it's usually someone who wants to eat you. So if a pair of huge black eyes suddenly appears out of the grass, everyone gets scared, and the cobra hides. I'll ask a stupid question in your place. Does the cobra know it has eyes on its back? Does this question provoke the reversal of thinking, the reversal of intuition, that the theory of evolution brings? No, the cobra doesn't know it has a pattern on its back. It has never looked in a mirror, leads a solitary life, and is unlikely to realize the connection between itself and other cobras. But if the cobra doesn't know this, someone must, therefore, know about it. Living organisms seem to be detailed. Plants do not ponder their flowers. But someone must know that, when viewed in ultraviolet light, patterns adapted to the vision of insects are visible. Someone should know that a leaf-tailed gecko looks exactly like a fallen leaf, and a stickleback looks like a stick. Someone needs to know that limbs are used to move through space, that the heart pumps blood and nerves conduct electrical signals. But if not the owners of the hearts and nerves themselves, then who? According to Darwin, all this complexity came about through selection. It's what drives the machine of evolution. Selection is a reflection of the world, of the demands and limitations in the properties and abilities of all life on Earth. Selection lets snakes with a frightening eye pattern on their backs into the future and leaves snakes with all other patterns in the past. It is because of selection that it seems to us that the world is intelligently designed. When people think of evolution as a random process, incapable of creative solutions like the eyes on a cobra's back, they simply do not realize the powerful and completely non-random creative force of selection. When we say natural selection, we understand the term in the narrow sense Darwin put into it: the survival of more adaptable variants of living organisms under the pressure of inevitable competition for resources. Darwin's original 1859 theory is that this natural selection is the primary explanation for any species traits. The term selection extends the current meaning of this theory and emphasizes its overall philosophical meaning. First, variants can survive regardless of competition for resources. Darwin himself did not claim that natural selection was strictly the only mechanism of evolution. Citing sexual selection, such as the selection of the colorful plumage of birds by the preferences of females. The point is that selection comes in many forms. Even if the main one is selection as a result of competition for resources, the strength of Darwin's theory is precisely that any selection can lead to evolution. What matters is that something is separated from something by some specific principle. In general, selection is more than the struggle of living organisms. Both in nature and in human society, it is simple. Good ideas survive, and bad ideas don't. Can we imagine variability and inheritance without selection? Suppose the world is populated by a variety of fungi that constantly mutate, do not compete at all, and happily multiply because they need nothing but space and humus. What will happen? The place and humus will sooner or later run out. Competition will begin, which means that someone will survive and someone will not. We must remember that everything material has limits, and where there are boundaries, there is selection. Even if we use the term selection in a broader sense, it is difficult to imagine infinite, unlimited reproduction. Suppose we are talking about variants of a program, and let's assume that these variants reproduce without any limits. That is, no matter how large the computer's memory capacity is, it has a limit. And if the code multiplies without limits, sooner or later it will hit this limit. In this case, the code may stop multiplying, or it may turn out that some variants know how to overwrite themselves in place of others, while others cannot do that. That is, there is an automatic competition for memory, which means that there is selection. Such mental experiments help to get a feel for an important idea. Selection is a property of any dynamic system that can preserve the accumulated experience. Selection is embedded in the logic of the universe. Selection, and by extension, evolution, are fundamental. In our succinct formulation, Darwin's theory is composed of three phenomena: variability, heredity, and selection. That's how evolution works. That is, the change of species over time. If there is variability, heredity, and selection, that guarantees evolution. In this abstract regularity, the main merit of Charles Robert Darwin is the elevation of evolution from the rank of biological hypotheses to the rank of a mathematically and philosophically grounded theory of the development of the world. But why is the evolution of species not considered a hypothesis? Why are we so certain that evolution is true? A hypothesis is a question that, in principle, can be answered. A hypothesis about evolution might sound like this. For example, species change over time. This particular hypothesis can be tested and confirmed by tracing the gradual changes in the genome of a rapidly reproducing microorganism, or, say, in the statistics of the occurrence of bird genotypes. A confirmed hypothesis becomes a scientific fact, and the existence of evolution as a phenomenon is logically indisputable. There may be other, more complex hypotheses. For example, man came from a monkey or life began in the ocean. Even if these hypotheses are not directly testable, they may be fundamentally true or false. In such cases, when hypothesis testing is not possible, we are guided by our ideas about reality. That is, theories. A theory is not just a question or even an answer. A theory is an explanation. Explanations of facts with the help of more general, more abstract principles. This is already a theory. A hypothesis is an assumption about something unknown. A theory is an explanation of something already known. Darwin had many hypotheses: that there must be transitional forms between species, that species are adapted exactly as much as the environment demands, and that man descended from the ape. These are all questions to which he hypothesized answers based on his vision of the internal logic of nature. That internal logic is Darwin's theory. Like any theory, it is not a question of the unknown, but an explanation of the known. Indeed, living nature is a very strange thing if you forget for a second all biological theories. Remember the Galapagos finches. We can, of course, assume that God created them by hearths, carefully adapting them to his own differences in vegetation and combining them with other, specially selected species. But this seems absurd and strange. Just as strange is everything else. Why are there so many species in the world? There are literally millions of them, and each one is unique in its own way. Most of this planetary diversity was never seen before the invention of the microscope. Why does God need all of this? And why, despite their countless differences, are all these species nevertheless so similar to each other? If they are all created by the Creator's boundless imagination, why are they all made up of cells? Why do insects have 6 legs and vertebrates have 4? Why does the flagellum of a human sperm cell look exactly like the flagellum of a single-celled alga? We will talk more about God at the end of this issue and try to give him a definition that does not contradict common sense. What does the theory of evolution explain? Theodosius Dobzhansky, a Soviet biologist who moved to the United States and created an optics without which it is impossible to look at life, formulated 2 fundamental qualities of living nature: diversity and unity. The presence of an unprecedented inordinate number of forms, coupled with the ordering of these forms into a unified system of groups and similarities, is what does not add up in living nature, assuming that living nature is in constant motion. Even the most immediate areas of biology, far removed from the fossil bones, simply do not come together without the theory of evolution. Without an evolutionary foundation, it is completely incomprehensible how squid nerve cells are related to human cells, how they can be so different from them, and yet be so similar to them. Any study on a model organism is basically based on the assumption that there is something in common between these organisms and humans, and that assumption is based on the theory of evolution. Drug testing, perhaps the most down-to-earth and practically oriented field in biology, also requires evolutionary thinking. Otherwise, for example, it is not clear why a cell would need so many molecules that are so eager to cause cancer in it, or what is the motivation behind a receptor that sends a self-suicide signal to the nucleus. All these questions fall into place only if we remember about selection and the millions of generations that precede any process in a living organism. To understand life on Earth, one must somehow bend conventional thinking in an unaccustomed way. The easiest way to do this is to imagine a God, an intelligent creator. This does a good job of explaining why all living things are so intelligently designed. But an intelligent creator does not explain well the immense diversity of life and its unity. These properties of living nature are much more easily explained by evolution, origin with change. Why are there so many species in the world? Because all living things are in constant motion in all directions, and species are simply a current slice of that movement through time. Why are they so similar to each other? Because they come from common ancestors, and the closer the common ancestor of 2 species, the greater their similarity. Why are they so cleverly arranged? Because they have been changing for a long time and have managed to solve so many inventive problems. And when so many problems are solved, it looks as if they never happened. It is worth returning to our automobile metaphor. Variability has become the fuel, heredity of the wheels, and selection of the driver. But the car has no engine. Evolution has one engine: time. It is the nature of time that determines the fundamental fact that nothing is eternal. A stone with its unique shape, which sooner or later will disappear without a trace, is not eternal. Nor is an RNA molecule eternal. What is time? This is the direction of movement of events from order to chaos, from the singularity preceding the Big Bang to the homogeneous soup of heat into which the universe will sooner or later turn. From the perspective of the cosmos and the theory of evolution, this is life on Earth realizing itself. In the mid-19th century, when The Origin of Species was published, even in the educated society surrounding Darwin, the idea of biological evolution, that is, change in species over time, was religiously risky. Darwin, of course, was not the first to realize that species could change, but he was able to substantiate the idea in such a way that those around him would not just believe it, but see it right in front of their eyes. What is more interesting to us today about the theory of evolution is another thing. Evolution doesn't just explain how some species can come from other species. It explains how all species can come from one. It doesn't matter which ones, man, bird, snail, fungus. They are all, in Darwin's interpretation, related by parallel branches of the same story starting from the same point. According to Darwin, all existing species are leaders of the same endless race for the right not to become extinct. The emergence of the theory of evolution is a fundamental marker in human history. Humans used to be the highest form of life, but now they are one of its many branches. The world used to be static. The entire diversity of beings simply existed in the form once given to it by its creator. Now the world has become dynamic. Not only humans, but every living thing, every property and trait of every living thing. A thread of cause and effect stretched into the past, leading through thousands of generations, across continents and epochs, and eventually converging with other threads to a common unified source. British biologist Richard Dawkins described the significance of this upheaval this way. Intelligent life on any given planet reaches maturity when its bearers first grasp the meaning of their own existence. If higher beings from outer space ever visit Earth, the first question they will ask in order to ascertain the level of our civilization will be, have we succeeded in discovering evolution? The very fact that we humans have, with our minds, come to understand evolution is a triumph. But a triumph not so much for our species as for all life on Earth. Ultimately, Darwin's theory that our destiny is inseparable from that of our ancestors. However, our development must have come to a halt at some point. Geopolitical catastrophes are proof of that. Are we all doomed, having soared like Icarus so high, so close to the sun to fall? Our pessimism in reasoning about the established evolution of humanity is nothing but a consequence of cognitive distortions, argues Steven Pinker, a Canadian-American scientist and science popularizer specializing in experimental psychology, psycholinguistics, and cognitive science. The world appears to us as a bleak and rapidly deteriorating place because this is the picture the media broadcasts every day. For the most part, the news covers isolated events that in and of themselves tell us nothing about trends. A school shooting does not mean that there is more violence in the world every day, but this event gets on the front pages of newspapers much faster than graphs reflecting the real state of affairs. Next, what Pinker, following his psychologist colleagues, calls the availability heuristic is triggered. A person tends to consider more probable the event for which it is easier for him to recall the corresponding example. This is why many people are afraid of flying on airplanes, but almost no one is afraid of driving cars. Airplane crashes happen much less often, but they look more spectacular and are more often covered in the media. It's no wonder that under the daily onslaught of vivid, shocking, and traumatizing news, our perception of reality is distorted. Everyone would agree that life is better than death. Health is better than disease. Freedom is better than tyranny. Literacy is better than ignorance. These metrics are countable. Pinker demonstrates through a multitude of graphs and statistical calculations that the modern world is not at all as bad as it may seem. Life expectancy since the 18th century has increased from 29 years to 71. Medicine in the last 10 years has become available to more and more people, including the poorest. Life has become not only healthier and safer, but also richer. The average person enjoys incomparably more than in the 20th century. Democracy continues to spread around the world. And modern autocracies are far less repressive than the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. To whom do we owe our prosperity? Pinker gives a very definite answer here too: to Enlightenment thinkers. The ideals of reason, science, humanism, and progress still drive humanity towards a bright future, even if it seems to us that the opposite is true. Now begins the most difficult to comprehend part of the issue. We will talk about the evolution of the very idea of progress or evolution. It's going to be difficult for some, really, but we need to get to the end. Let's do it together. The origins of the theory of evolution lie much deeper than it may seem. First of all, it is the very idea of linear development, associated with a quite definite concept of time. If progress exists, then history moves along a straight line or a curve, but in any case in a linear dimension. Today, it is quite easy to conceptualize the historical process in this way. But to an ancient Greek, such an idea would have seemed strange. Antique man correlated himself first of all with the cosmos. The concept of cosmos meant not just the material universe. It meant the immutable order of existence that replaced chaos. For the Greeks, historical reality was a faint reflection of this higher order. Only eternity is truly real. Plato's cave comes to mind. The best expression of the cosmos in the earthly reality was the movement in a circle, the change of seasons, the rotation of the heavenly lights. This movement had neither beginning nor end. Moments and eternity merged in it. The circular motion of the cosmos and natural cycles served as a model for comprehending history. In antiquity, history was seen as a circularity of events, a constant return to the original order. If there are stages of revival and decline, then only within a single cycle, which is replaced by another. Christianity brings a completely different perception of history. In the Bible, history acts as a meeting place between man and God. All human things, wars and catastrophes, birth and death of individual people, all these events are no longer pale shadows on the walls of Plato's cave, but stages of a single dramatic plot covering the entire history of mankind. The path from the creation of the world to the second coming of Jesus is a path that has a beginning and an end. Biblical eschatology, the doctrine of the end of the world, excludes cyclicality. Historical time no longer moves in circles, but seeks its consummation, the apocalypse. Aurelius Augustine was the first to describe world history as a single regular process, proceeding in linear time. It was with him that the idea of progress first appears in its full form. According to Augustine, the history of mankind is the battlefield of the earthly hail and the heavenly hail. That is, the community of the people of earth and the people of God, the material and the spiritual, the state and the church. In earthly life, the boundaries between these communities are invisible. They lurk in the struggle of opposites in man. Progress in Augustine acquires the character of objective inevitability. All human beings are only executors of the divine plan, which one way or another will come to completion. But strict moral requirements are imposed on God's people. This means that the expansion of the heavenly city leads to the moral improvement of mankind. Augustine is far from cloudless optimism, but he sees the stages of human history as necessary stages of maturation. We are not simply moving toward a common goal in a straight line. We are moving on an upward trajectory. But the modern age is destined to change everything. It tears the idea of progress away from its Christian roots and transplants it to the soil of nature. Images of the transcendent kingdom of God are replaced by technocratic utopias, and divine providence is replaced by boundless faith in rationality and science. The hopes and aspirations of mankind move from heaven to earth. Francis Bacon's utopia, New Atlantis, shows how perfectly people can organize their lives on earth through reason, science, and technology. At the center of Bacon's ideal island is the House of Solomon, an order of scientists who conduct scientific research, introduce new inventions, and efficiently manage the country's resources. As a result, the state is prosperous and the social order is close to ideal. Unlike the heavenly hail of the Christian Middle Ages, the new earthly paradise is quite attainable. Unlike other earthly paradise projects, however, Bacon's utopia does not require large-scale social upheaval. Power is not in politics, but in knowledge. Bacon, who first applied the word progress in a temporal rather than spatial sense, urged man to dominate nature through knowledge of its laws. Mankind manages to make time its tool. The temporal environment becomes the new springboard of progress. Human reason takes the place of divine providence. The idea of progress becomes the new faith of Western civilization. The 18th, 19th centuries is an era of great controversy. The Christian eschatological perspective became irrelevant. The end of the world was postponed indefinitely. It was necessary to determine what the endpoint was, what humanity was moving towards, what it was worth fighting for, and by what means. Everyone was united by the belief that with the help of reason, by joint efforts, people could improve their situation. The end began to determine the means, while the manual Kant's eternal world allowed for an evolutionary path of development. Marx's classless society demanded blood. Kant believed that progress takes place first in the head and then in social institutions. Marx saw revolution as the natural outcome of the class struggle. Historical reality in the 19th century seemed to play into the hands of theorists of progress and social evolution. The Industrial Revolution, rising prosperity, scientific discoveries, and democratic movements made it possible to believe that there was no limit to improvement. In the late 19th century, progressive hopes moved into the realm of science and industrial modernization. Auguste Comte paints a picture of the progress of positive knowledge in which old religious and metaphysical prejudices will be discarded. Darwin's evolution is seen as progress, the primary means of which is the struggle of species for a place in the sun. No trace remains of the pacifism of the 18th century. In its place comes competition, colonization, the struggle for space, and eugenic projects to breed the perfect man. It is only natural that progress, understood in biological terms, demands physical improvement of human nature. Francis Galton, the founder of eugenics, proposed to introduce it into the national consciousness as a religion. Well, for a while his idea won out. In the 1920s, eugenic programs were supported in the USA, Germany, England, Scandinavian countries. The question of the evolution of mankind, the meaning and purpose of progress, was too complex to give an unambiguous answer. In the hands of left and right populists, the idea of progress turned out to be a terrible weapon. Is the final point of history cognizable at all, if it exists? Classical liberals saw their goal as the endless improvement of the human condition. A socialist paradise seemed more stationary. The 20th century, with its world wars, atomic weapons, and existential emptiness, undermined faith in a bright future. The philosophy of this time became interested in the shadow side of progress. The Holocaust was the dark final chord in the symphony of enlightenment. Science and technology have not liberated man, but entrenched him in a new world where power spreads stamped opinions through mass culture. The crisis of the natural sciences has undermined the dream of a limitless expansion of knowledge. And pollution and environmental destruction have raised the question of the limits to the growth of technological progress. Every progressive trend has its downside. The growth of megacities and urbanization generates alienation and a whole complex of social and personal psychopathological syndromes. Industrial development leads to environmental destruction. On the other hand, the idea of progress or evolution retains its value as a symbol. In politics, progressive forces still call for fighting against the people of the past and pushing for change. Tech companies plant a cult of novelty. Transhumanists and futurologists want to free humans from biological limitations. But even as we look anxiously to the near future, there is hope for the better in the longer term. The theory of progress, which is giving up its position, has not yet been replaced by a new holistic concept. Postmodernism of the second half of the 20th century was a stage of total negation, ridiculing everything, including the ideals of enlightenment. The postmodern era in which you and I live, with its pervasive irony, provides absolutely no guidance. This is a fact that we can directly observe. Information noise creates a semantic vacuum in which everything ceases to have any meaning. Well, God is certainly not our creator. He didn't design every living thing. Our design is authored by natural selection. At the same time, the opposition between creationists and evolutionists seems completely far-fetched. The truth is that God is the one who pushed the dominoes, set off the chain reaction, the singularity, the Big Bang, and then you and me. Thank you for watching. This channel is created because of your support. A special thank you to our sponsors. We really appreciate it. It's very important to us.